One day she said to me after we had realized that the two of us had fallen in love.
I mean, the actors are staggering. The guy that plays Gregory Allman, I was sitting kind of in the back because I didn't want to make a big scene, which I ended up making a big scene.
Have you ever wondered what really went on behind closed doors when two of the biggest stars in music got married, only to have it all fall apart in just a few months?
I wanted to ask you about Cher, and boy, all of a sudden, because Gregg Allman, you didn't hear a lot about Gregg Allman for a while. Then all of a sudden he marries Cher, and boom.
I should have spent more time, because you have to become friends before you can ever entertain the idea of speaking the L word.
Gregg Allman and Cher were the ultimate odd couple, a pairing that captivated the entire world and left everyone wondering what went wrong. For years, people speculated and pointed fingers.
I have to say, I was the reason. It was me. It was definitely my fault that they didn't work. I love the life I live.
But the real answers never came from Gregg himself, at least not until he finally opened up about the whole thing. He didn't make excuses or blame Cher. He just told the truth, plain and simple. So let's hear what Gregg Allman finally had to say about Cher and their brief, unforgettable marriage. The making of a Southern rock legend. Before we get into the marriage, we need to understand who Gregg Allman really was and where he came from. Gregg was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1947, which is basically the capital of country music. But his family wasn't exactly a happy one. His dad was a World War II veteran who had a serious drinking problem, and he ended up leaving the family when Gregg was still just a little kid. That left his mom to raise him and his older brother Dwayne all by herself. It wasn't easy, but it created a really tight bond between the two brothers. They were all each other had, and they stuck together through everything. When Gregg was about 8 years old, his mom bought him his first guitar, and he was instantly hooked. By the time he was 13, he was already playing in local bands and learning all the blues and R&B records he could get his hands on. Dwayne was the same way. They were both obsessed with music, and they spent countless hours listening to records, practicing their instruments, and dreaming about making it big one day. The Allman household was always filled with music. They listened to blues, country, and soul, and all of that would later come together in the unique sound that the Allman Brothers Band would become famous for. As teenagers, the brothers were drawn to the rock scene that was exploding in the 1960s, and they knew they wanted to be a part of it. They formed their first band together, called the Escorts, and later changed the name to the Allman Joys. Eventually, they became the Hourglass, which took them all the way out to Los Angeles. But California wasn't really their scene. They didn't like the corporate music industry or the pressure to sound like everyone else. Gregg later talked about how tired they were of playing other people's songs. Club owners would only hire them if they played a certain number of top 40 hits and Beatles covers, and that wasn't what they wanted to do. They had their own music inside them, and they were desperate to get it out. Dwayne was the more confident one. He kept telling Gregg that they were going to be the best, that they just needed to keep pushing forward. Gregg wasn't as sure. He actually wanted to finish high school, just in case the music thing didn't work out. He figured he could always fall back on something else. But Dwayne wouldn't hear any of it. He convinced Gregg to drop out and commit to the band full-time. That was a big decision for a kid who had heard his whole life that you needed at least a high school education to get anywhere. But Dwayne had this incredible belief in what they were doing, and he managed to convince Gregg to take the leap. They went back to the South and formed the Allman Brothers Band in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1969. And that's when things really started to take off. The Allman Brothers Band had a sound that was completely different from anything else at the time. They mixed rock, blues, jazz, and country into something that felt fresh and exciting. Their songs were long and improvisational, with extended solos that let each musician show off their skills. Dwayne's slide guitar playing was absolutely revolutionary, and Gregg's soulful voice and keyboard work provided the perfect contrast. Their first album was a critical success, but it was their live shows that really made them legendary. They built a reputation as one of the best live bands in the country, and their album, At Fillmore East, captured that magic perfectly. They were on top of the world, the kings of Southern rock, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. But then, tragedy struck. In 1971, Gregg Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident. It was a devastating blow for Gregg. He had lost his brother, his musical partner, and his best friend all at once. He was completely shattered, and he didn't know how he was going to go on. But he did go on. The band continued, with Gregg stepping up as the leader. They released the album Brothers and Sisters in 1973, which featured their biggest hit, Ramblin' Man. It was a massive success and established Gregg as a major star in his own right. He had come out of his brother's shadow and proven that he could lead the band to even greater heights. But with success came all the temptations that came with being a rock star in the 1970s. Gregg got heavily into drugs and alcohol, and it started to take a serious toll on his health and his personal life. He was living the rock and roll dream, but he was also struggling with demons that would follow him for decades. And it was during this wild period of his life that he met Cher, the woman who would become one of his most famous and tumultuous partners. The meeting of two worlds. So how did Gregg Allman and Cher actually end up together? It's one of those classic rock and roll stories that sounds almost too crazy to be true. It was 1975, and both of them were at the absolute peak of their fame. Gregg was the frontman of one of the biggest rock bands in the world, and Cher was a global superstar who had achieved massive success as a singer, actress, and television personality. She had first become famous as part of the duo Sonny and Cher, but she had since struck out on her own and become even bigger. She was one of the most recognizable women on the planet, and her face was everywhere. On the surface, they seemed like complete opposites. Gregg was a Southern boy who was most comfortable in the swamps and bars of the South, playing his music for crowds of sweaty rock fans. Cher was a California girl who had grown up in Los Angeles and had become the ultimate symbol of Hollywood glamour. But when they met at a party in Los Angeles, something clicked between them. Cher was immediately drawn to Gregg's Southern charm and his soulful eyes, and he was equally captivated by her beauty and her magnetic personality. There was this instant chemistry between them that you just can't explain. It was electric, and they both felt it right away. Cher later said that she felt an immediate connection with Gregg, and that she was drawn to his raw, unpolished authenticity. He was completely different from the polished, manufactured people she was used to in Hollywood. Gregg, for his part, was amazed that a woman of her stature would even be interested in him. He was a rough-around-the-edges rocker who was more comfortable on a stage than at a fancy Hollywood party. But Cher saw something in him that others didn't, and she was determined to get to know him better. They started a whirlwind romance that quickly became the talk of the music industry. The tabloids couldn't get enough of them, and they were constantly photographed together at events and premieres. People were fascinated by this unlikely pairing. Here was this Southern rocker and this Hollywood glamour queen, and somehow they had fallen for each other. It seemed like a match made in rock and roll heaven. But there was always this undercurrent of tension beneath the surface. These two people were from completely different worlds, and it was obvious that their differences were going to be a challenge. But, for a little while, they were the most talked-about couple in the world, and they seemed genuinely happy together. Just a few months after they met, Gregg and Cher surprised everyone by getting married. It was a quick decision, driven by passion and that sense of urgency that often comes with rock and roll relationships. They had a small, intimate ceremony, and for a moment it seemed like they had beaten the odds, but the challenges of their relationship were immediately obvious. Cher had a busy career that required her to be in Los Angeles or on location for film shoots. She was constantly working, and her schedule was packed. Gregg, on the other hand, was the leader of the Allman Brothers Band, which meant he was constantly on tour. He spent most of his time on the road, playing shows in cities all across America. Their lifestyles were completely incompatible, and they struggled to figure out how to make it work. They were both so busy and so committed to their careers that they barely had time to see each other, let alone build a life together. And that was just the beginning of their problems. The regional divide that could not be bridged. When Gregg was asked years later why his marriage to Cher didn't work out, he didn't try to sugarcoat it or make excuses. He was refreshingly honest about the whole thing. He said, plain and simple, that he didn't belong in Beverly Hills and she wasn't going to come down south. It was a fundamental regional divide that they simply couldn't overcome. Gregg was a Southern boy through and through. He loved everything about the South. He loved the slower pace of life, the friendly people, and the simple pleasures of country living. He liked Southern food, the warm weather, and the sense of community that he felt in his hometown. For him, the South was home, and he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. He had tried living in other places, including California, but it never felt right. He missed the black-eyed peas and chicken-fried steak that he couldn't find in Marin County. He missed the barbecue, the sweet tea, and the laid-back lifestyle that he was used to. He just couldn't get comfortable anywhere else. Cher, on the other hand, was a California girl through and through. She had grown up in Los Angeles and had built her entire career there. She was a creature of Hollywood, a woman who thrived on the energy and excitement of the entertainment capital of the world. The idea of moving to the South, to a place like Savannah, Georgia, was completely foreign to her. She was used to the glamour of Beverly Hills, the red carpets, and the fast-paced lifestyle that came with being a celebrity. She had no desire to leave all that behind for the slower, more traditional life that Gregg craved. It wasn't that she didn't love him, but she just couldn't imagine herself being happy in the South. She was a city girl, and the idea of living in a small southern town was simply too much to contemplate. This fundamental difference in where they wanted to live became a major source of tension in their marriage. Gregg wanted to be in the South, surrounded by his friends and his music. Cher wanted to be in Los Angeles, where her career and her life were centered. There was no way to reconcile these two visions, and it created constant conflict between them. Gregg tried living in California for a while, but it never felt right. He had a beautiful home in Marin County, and he loved the natural beauty of Northern California, but he couldn't get past the cultural differences. He felt like an outsider in California, a fish out of water in a place that seemed to value appearances above everything else. He missed the simplicity and authenticity of the South. He also missed his friends and his bandmates, who were all based in the South. The Allman Brothers Band was a Southern institution, and their music was deeply rooted in the culture and traditions of the region. Gregg couldn't separate himself from that. His music was in the South, and that's where he had to be. Cher had no such ties to the region. Her career was built in Hollywood, and she had no desire to uproot herself and start over somewhere else. The regional divide wasn't just about geography, It was about a fundamental difference in lifestyle and values. Gregg was a man who valued simplicity and authenticity. He didn't care about designer clothes or fancy cars. He just wanted to play his music and be with the people he loved. Cher, on the other hand, was a product of the entertainment industry. She was used to being in the spotlight, to being surrounded by glamour and luxury. She was a fashion icon who had to maintain a certain image, and that was a pressure that Gregg couldn't fully understand. He wasn't a glamorous rock star. He was just a musician who happened to be famous. The differences in their lifestyles and values created a constant tension in their relationship, and it became clear that they were never going to be able to fully reconcile their two worlds. The marriage was doomed from the start, not because they didn't love each other, but because they were simply too different to make it work. It's sad, really, because they did love each other. But love isn't always enough to overcome such fundamental differences. The drugs, the drama, and the heartbreak. The regional divide was a huge problem, but it wasn't the only one. Gregg was also struggling with a serious drug addiction, and that put an enormous strain on their marriage. The Allman Brothers Band had been right in the middle of the drug culture that was everywhere in rock and roll in the 1970s, and Gregg had developed a heavy dependence on heroin and other drugs. His addiction was a constant source of worry for Cher, who had seen the damage that drugs could do in her own life and in the lives of others. She wanted to help him, but it was a battle he would ultimately have to fight for himself. The drugs had a profound effect on Gregg's behavior and his personality. He was often moody and unreliable. He would disappear for days at a time, leaving Cher to worry about him and deal with the fallout of his addiction. It was a chaotic and stressful environment for her, and it took a serious toll on her own mental health and well-being. She loved him, but she couldn't continue to live in a state of constant anxiety and fear. Cher had her own pressures to deal with, too. She was a massive star, and her career demanded constant attention and energy. She was working on albums, filming movies, and maintaining her public image, all while trying to manage the chaos of her marriage. It was an impossible balancing act, and the stress was starting to show. She was also dealing with the judgment of the public and the media, who were constantly scrutinizing her relationship with Gregg and predicting its demise. The tabloids seemed to love the drama of their marriage, and the constant speculation was a source of stress for both of them. Cher later admitted that she didn't always handle the pressure well, and that she sometimes took her frustrations out on Gregg. The marriage was a roller coaster of emotions, with moments of intense passion and love, followed by periods of conflict and distance. It was a classic rock and roll love story, complete with all the highs and lows that come with being in the spotlight. Another big issue was control. Gregg and Cher were both incredibly strong-willed people who were used to getting their way. Gregg was a band leader, used to calling the shots and having things done his way. Cher was a superstar who was used to being in control of her own career and her own life. When they came together, their egos clashed in a big way. Gregg later admitted that he had a habit of trying to control the women in his life, and that it was one of the reasons why his marriages had failed. He wanted things done his way, and he didn't always compromise. Cher, for her part, was not the type of woman who would simply go along with whatever her husband wanted. She had her own opinions and her own needs, and she wasn't afraid to express them. This clash of wills created a constant power struggle in their relationship, and it made it difficult for them to find any kind of peace. They were both used to being the center of attention, and neither was willing to take a back seat. This dynamic was especially problematic when it came to career decisions. Gregg wanted Cher to be more involved in his musical world, to come down south and experience the life he loved. Cher wanted Gregg to be more present in her world, to accompany her to Hollywood events, and be the supportive husband she needed. They both wanted the other to change, but neither was willing to give up what was important to them. It was a recipe for disaster, and it's amazing that the marriage lasted as long as it did. The breaking point came after just a few months. The pressure of their incompatible lifestyles and their personal struggles proved to be too much. Cher filed for divorce in 1977, citing irreconcilable differences. It was a bitter end to a relationship that had started with so much promise, and it left both of them heartbroken. Gregg later admitted that the failure of the marriage was his fault. He said he was too difficult to live with, and that his addiction had been a major problem. He should have spent more time getting to know Cher before they got married, and they should have worked harder to become friends before they tried to become lovers. He admitted that he had made mistakes, but the damage was already done. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of rock and roll's most fascinating relationships, please leave a comment below and let us know what you thought. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the golden age of rock and roll.